Okay, I think we're going to get started. If you're virtual, my hope is that you can hear me. So we're going to hear from four exciting speakers or four exciting talks in this session. First up is about U.S. asylum cases. So I'll let you guys take it away.
Hello, and thank you for being here. Today, we'd like to talk to you about bias in the U.S. asylum system. We are a team of researchers from Berkeley who've used machine learning to analyze nearly 6 million U.S. asylum cases. We found that more often than not, the decision to grant asylum depends not on the individual merits of the case, but on the combined effects of the surrounding political environment and the individual variability of the presiding judge. These findings are ultimately at odds with core democratic principles of fairness and due process. First, some background about us. We are a team of 13 researchers at Berkeley with interdisciplinary backgrounds ranging from computer science, cognitive science, and data science to philosophy, political science, and human rights. We work at the Investigations Lab at UC Berkeley's Human Rights Center, a world-renowned research center that trains students to use open source technology to investigate war crimes and human rights abuses around the world. Our project also built on our prior work with Human Rights First, where we investigated discrepancies in credible Vera review and bond decisions in the US asylum system. As we discuss our findings, here are 3 points about asylum to keep in mind. 1, as defined by the United Nations Convention on the Status of Refugees, an asylum seeker refers to any person who has been displaced from their country of origin due to a, quote, well-founded fear of being persecuted, on the basis, specifically, of one of these 5 characteristics: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. 2, asylum proceedings are conducted either affirmatively through the US Citizenship and Immigration Services or defensively through the Executive Office of Immigration Review, which involves pleading one's case in front of an immigration judge. In this study, we will be using data from that EOIR on defensive asylum cases. And lastly, 3, immigration courts cannot themselves establish precedent, making them more susceptible to variations in asylum decisions based on a variety of factors that can be irrelevant to the merits of the case. So to touch briefly on the existing literature, prior research has exposed striking disparities in US asylum grant rates as a function of what we are calling so-called extraneous factors, that is, factors that are irrelevant to the merits of whether someone should or should not be granted asylum. Notably, the refugee roulette paper was an influential paper that found that women judges were 44% more likely to grant asylum. Judges who had previously worked at private immigration law firms, as well as NGOs, or who were previously full-time faculty at law schools were also more likely to grant asylum. The economist Daniel Chen has also run studies with several different collaborators using predicting modeling to empirically reinforce these findings that extraneous factors are highly predictive of asylum decisions. All in all, there is extensive research on the impact of extraneous variables on case outcomes. Here on the right, you see a list of extraneous variables that have already been studied, all of which are ostensibly unrelated to the merits of the case. This phenomenon is sometimes disparagingly referred to as the, quote, what the judge had for breakfast phenomenon, because seemingly trivial things, like whether the weather that morning was particularly dreary, or whether the local team lost the football game the night before, or even whether the applicant had the same initials as the presiding judge, all have statistically predictive effects on the outcomes of cases. However, much of the existing literature is focused on Article 3 courts, that is, not asylum courts, and much of the existing research does not handle decision variability in a way that can be compared across spatial and temporal boundaries. Ultimately, then, we sought to fill this gap by asking the following question: how variable, if at all, are judicial decisions in asylum adjudication? And particularly, what is the relationship between asylum decisions, individual judge characteristics, and factors that are systemic in asylum cases? I will turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you. So let's put a pin on that for just a second and talk about our data set. We gathered data from 2 sets of open source information made publicly available through Freedom of Information Act requests. First was case proceedings information from the Executive Office of Immigration Review. And second, biographical information on immigration judges from the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse. After some pretty extensive pre-processing, this resulted in a final data set of about 6 million cases with 230 or so different features on details of each proceeding and the various actors involved. We used feature engineering in this process to compute various different items of interest based on our literature review, such as the time between the start of a case and the end of the case, and the total number of decisions a judge issued in a given month. Okay, so going back to our research question, how do we measure individual and systemic bias? The conceptual framework we use for this task is inspired by counterfactual fairness, which comes from the machine learning fairness literature. As posited by Kusner et al., counterfactual fairness claims that a decision is fair if it stays constant when one single thing differs in a counterfactual world. This one single thing that we looked at was the presiding judge when looking at individual judge variability, and political climate when looking at broader systemic factors. And more on how we adapted each of these will come later. But first, how did we operationalize the notion of counterfactual worlds? So while we were sadly unable to access the multiverse for this project, the sheer volume of cases in our data set meant that we found very, very similar cases across the board, and we could use those as sort of proxies for counterfactual worlds. When doing so, we kept in mind the limitation of counterfactual fairness, which is that it doesn't always make sense in practice to change one thing about an individual instance and expect everything else to stay the same. Thus, we defined similar cases a bit more loosely as sharing the nationality of the asylum seeker, the immigration court in which the proceeding was held, and the time period in which the decision was made. With this in mind, we formed a specific type of individual bias, inter-judge cohort consistency. Along the lines of counterfactual fairness, we defined a given judge as consistent if other judges presiding over similar cases on average ruled in the same way that they did. We computed this for each proceeding represented by delta by finding the subset of proceedings, proceeding subdelta, where the judge was different, and finding the proportion of agreement from that. Then we averaged this value into omega subdelta across all the decisions made by a given judge and created a cumulative score for them. Okay. On the other hand, we conceptualize systemic bias as partisanship. Once again, relying on this framework of counterfactual fairness, we defined a decision as partisan if changing the political climate in which it was made resulted in the opposite decision. And so for the purposes of this project, we defined political climate as consisting of 2 factors. the political party of the presidential administration involved and the political party of the candidate that the state voted for in the last presidential election, thus representing political climate on a state and national level. After this, we computed the set of similar proceedings, once again, proceeding sub delta, where either of these two variables for political climate were different. And then we found the proportion of disagreement. It is important to note that this results in a politically neutral score. The scoring itself does not imply Republican or Democrat leanings. All right. So after computing both cohort consistency and partisanship, we ran a variety of analyses using predictive modeling to gain insights from our data set. For the sake of time, we won't talk about all of these, and I'll just highlight a few. So first, we created binary classifiers for asylum decisions that take in just partisanship and consistency scores and tested them on a subset of our data. On the right, you can see asylum decisions plotted along these two variables, with pink representing denials and blue representing grants. To our surprise, the models that we trained performed extremely well, with an accuracy of around 95% and an R-squared of around 60%. For context, the best classifiers in the literature averaged at about 85% accuracy. And let's take a moment to absorb this. 60% of the variability in asylum decisions can be captured through two metrics that ostensibly represent bias. What does that say about the state of asylum decisions in the US? Of course, there are caveats to this. First, this is not causal, and second, there is some leakage of decision when computing these scores, but the striking relationship remains, and we also consistently outperformed everything in past bodies of work. We also looked at how partisanship score varies over the years. Given our unique definition of partisanship, this essentially investigates how susceptible decisions are to changes in political climate over time. We aggregated partisanship data by week and used Facebook Profit to decompose into seasonal and trend components. As you can see on the left, partisanship has a clear rise starting in the 90s, reaching a local peak around 2003, before rising again starting into 2014. And let me hand it over to Katie to close us off.
Perfect, thank you. So to reiterate, partisanship and cohort consistency, those scores alone capture over 58% of all case variability. This is obviously troubling news because it suggests that variables that are designed to represent bias are highly predictive of a case's outcome. These findings, as iterated before, are ultimately at odds with core democratic notions of due process and fairness. Additionally, immigration courts tend to overwhelmingly deny asylum. This finding is reflected in the strong association between asylum grant rates and our partisanship metric. Lastly, we found troubling news that partisanship is on the rise, raising concerns of greater and continued impact on asylum adjudication. Though this may be due to a multitude of factors, it is likely due to the combined effects of these three phenomena. 1, a national increase in political polarization and populism globally. 2, voters being increasingly susceptible to extreme narratives and the influence of non-civilian actors. And 3, that politicians increasingly campaign on divisive issues as a result of growing suspicion towards policies like open immigration and globalization. Ultimately, then, we found significant and predictable tendencies towards bias throughout the US immigration court system. For a nation that prides itself on fairness and due process, these findings are deeply troubling. But leveraging computing as a diagnostic tool, we hope to better hold these systems accountable. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the great talk. We've got about 3 minutes for questions. So if you have anything, raise your hand and we'll bring it up. I can start us off. Can you just give me a sense of what the... Hi. So thanks again for the great talk. Can you give me a sense of how much control an asylum seeker might have over like where they go to court, what judge they see? I just don't know what level of control they might have. Thanks.
Yeah, that's fair. And so in most cases, the judges are randomly assigned, as are the asylum seekers. So they do not have much control on where exactly they end up. But that's a great question. And that somewhat differs from, for example, Article 3 courts. If anything.
Reuters published a very interesting study on 2 women who essentially had the same backstories on their reasons for applying to asylum. And one of them was tried in Charlotte and one was tried in San Francisco. And this was pretty much arbitrarily assigned, and they had differing outcomes on their case. So this variability has extreme consequences.
Yeah, thanks for an interesting talk. Can you say something about the partisanship within judges versus maybe new incoming judges? So what is people's own opinion maybe, or processes shifting, or what is composition of judges?
Yeah, so the data that we have access to does not contain information on the political stances of the judges. So we essentially accommodated for this by looking at how decisions change through different political climates. And for individual judges specifically, we looked at how consistent they were across different judges, which is not based in political climate, but our findings there were about, on average, judges agreed with 80% of the, 80% of the decisions that other judges made on cases similar to them.
And we have time for one more question. The next speaker was
Yeah, thank you so much. When I think about political climate, there's 2 things that come to mind for me. One is legitimate changes in policy. For example, presidential administrations can change the policy, which would obviously lead possibly to different outcomes. And the other is like, quote unquote, illegitimate illegitimate changes, because people are just interpreting things differently, where they're not supposed to, because the laws don't actually change. Were you actually able to, do you have any intuition for like how to tweeze out those 2 things by any chance?
Yeah, so that's a good point. And I think that's part of the reason why we chose to break things down in terms of individual variability separately from political climate and the variability resulting from that. And I guess if I'm understanding your question correctly, we don't, because we don't have information on how individual judges are perceiving various things and their interpretation of the law, and also the lack of precedent in the immigration court system. We relied on trying to find their agreement with other judges as a metric for how I struggle with the wording on this, but how generally cohesive the legal opinion is on a particular topic, and whether they deviated significantly from that.